The morning mist clung low to the ground, weaving through the crooked fences and empty lanes of the old American village as if it carried secrets meant only for the trees. The world felt half awake, wrapped in gray silence, except for the distant caw of a crow perched on a church steeple. In this stillness, one figure moved quietly, an orphan girl with a thin frame, worn shoes, and eyes that carried more questions than answers. She had grown up on the edge of the settlement, watched but never fully embraced, a child shaped by both hardship and an unshakable will to belong. People whispered about her. Some said she was too curious, too restless for her own good. Others said her stubborn heart would one day lead her into trouble. Yet none could deny that she carried something rare, an instinct to notice what others overlooked, to see patterns in the woods, to hear what others ignored in the wind. It was this gift, or perhaps curse, that set her apart on the morning the story began. The night before, word had spread like wildfire that a child from the nearby native tribe had gone missing. No one knew how or why, only that the boy had vanished into the forest, leaving no trace behind. The air inside the village grew tight with unease. Fear of the unknown was stronger here than trust, and though the settlers and the tribe exchanged goods and guarded respect, there was still distance, still shadows of suspicion between them. Many muttered that the forest swallowed children whole, that no one should chase after him, for to do so would be to invite misfortune. But the girl could not stay still. She knew what it meant to be forgotten, to feel like a piece of the world had turned its back. The thought of a child alone in those woods, lost, afraid, unheard, gnawed at her chest like hunger. Without waiting for the elder's permission, she tied her faded shawl, clutched the small knife she carried for protection, and slipped away before dawn. Following the line where the meadow kissed the first wall of pines, the forest was no stranger to her. Its paths had been her refuge when the village felt too heavy with stairs, its streams her comfort when food was scarce. But that morning it felt different. Every crack of a twig echoed louder, every rustle of leaves seemed to whisper warnings. She bent low, scanning the damp soil for signs, tracing faint impressions of a child's foot where the earth softened near the roots. The trail was thin, almost ghost-like, but it was there, tugging her forward deeper into the woods. Hours slipped by, though time in the forest had no measure except for the rising sun and the calls of hidden birds. The girl pressed on, brushing branches aside, her breath quick but steady. She thought of the boy she had never met, what he must feel, what dangers circled around him. She pictured him calling out, voice swallowed by the trees, waiting for someone to answer. And with every step, she felt as if she were walking not just for him but for herself, for every day she had spent unseen. The deeper she went, the more the woods closed in, thick with vines and damp shadows. Strange tracks appeared, marks not belonging to deer nor fox. The girl crouched, her fingers brushing the earth. Something or someone else had passed through here. For the first time since leaving the village, unease crawled up her spine. She listened, straining against the silence. Then, faintly, she caught at the sound of movement ahead. Not steady footsteps, but stumbling, hurried, desperate. Her heart quickened. She followed, careful but swift, until she came to a clearing where dawnlight spilled like fire through the canopy. There, just beyond the fallen log, she caught a glimpse. A boy, no older than 7, his clothes torn, his face streaked with dirt. His eyes widened when he saw her, half in fear, half in relief. Before she could speak, before she could even reach him, a sharp crack echoed in the distance like a branch breaking under heavy weight. The boy froze. The girl's breath caught. She turned her head slowly toward the sound, and in that instant, she knew they were not alone. Something moved in the shadows of the trees, watching, waiting. The forest, once her companion, now felt like a cage tightening around them. She stepped forward, raising a hand to the boy, whispering for him not to run. Her voice was calm, though her heart pounded like a drum. The morning sun had broken through the mist, but it offered no comfort. What waited in the woods was still unseen, and what came next would decide everything. The child's hand twitched toward hers, trembling but reaching. Behind them, the trees shivered as if stirred by a breath, not their own. And in that fragile moment, between escape and danger, between trust and fear, the story was only just beginning. The boy's eyes darted nervously toward the sound in the trees, his small chest rising and falling as though every breath might be his last. The girl felt the weight of the moment press down on her. She wanted to tell him that he was safe, that she would guide him back, but the forest seemed to laugh at such promises. Its shadows moved like restless spirits, and every rustle carried a warning. She lowered her hand slowly, making sure not to startle him, and whispered, almost like a prayer, "Stay close." He hesitated, his bare feet shifting against the damp earth. For a moment she thought he might bolt, vanish deeper into the thickets where even she could not follow. But then his small hand brushed hers, hesitant and trembling, and the warmth of his touch felt both fragile and powerful. She had never held anything so important in her life. The forest watched. She could feel it. Branches bent as if underhidden. Weight and faint markings on nearby trees caught her eye symbols carved deep, worn by time but unmistakable. She had seen nothing like them before, though something in their shape whispered of boundaries and warnings, the kind that only those born to the woods could understand. She wondered if the boy had crossed where he shouldn't, or if someone had led him here on purpose. Her mind flashed to the village, the faces of those who would not dare step beyond the meadow. She could imagine the older men shaking their heads, insisting that no one should meddle with what belonged to the tribe. She could hear the fearful mutters, "Best leave him, or the forest will claim more." But she knew fear often spoke louder than truth. The boy was alive, trembling beside her, and that was reason enough. They moved together through the clearing, careful not to make noise. She scanned the ground for prints, for clues, while her ears strained for any sign of pursuit. Each sound seemed louder than it should be, the snap of a twig, the brush of a branch, the beat of her own pulse in her ears. Still, she pressed forward, guiding the boy toward a stream she knew cut through the woods like a silver thread. Water might hide their tracks, or at least give them a clearer path back. As they walked, she studied him. His dark eyes were wide, alert in a way no child should have to be. His small frame bore scratches, and his clothes, woven from cloth not like the settlers, but from the tribes, were torn. He looked at her with both suspicion and hope, as if torn between running away and clinging to her side. She did not speak much, sensing words might only startle him further. Instead, she let her presence, steady and watchful, be enough. By the time they reached the stream, the first rays of dawn were brightening the canopy. The water shimmered pale gold, rippling gently over stones. She crouched low, letting the boy drink, but her gaze never left the trees. Something still lingered behind them. She could feel it, like eyes pressing on the back of her neck. The boy's lips trembled as he bent to drink, and when he lifted his face, he finally spoke. His voice was small, rough from thirst. They followed. Her stomach tightened. She wanted to ask who, but the way he said it told her enough. Not animals, not lost villagers, something else. She placed her hand gently on his shoulder, steadying him. "We'll keep moving," she whispered, though even as she said it, she felt the weight of dread pressing harder. The stream led them deeper. The trees thickened, their trunks rising like ancient guardians. Now and then, the girl thought she saw shapes flicker between the shadows, but when she blinked, they were gone. The boy walked close, his small steps quick, his breath sharp. The Forest seemed endless, and yet she knew its folds and paths well. She trusted her feet, though her heart beat harder with each turned out as the sun lifted higher. Birds began to call, their song sharp and scattered. It should have been comforting, but instead, it felt like an alarm ringing through the woods. The girl quickened her pace, leading the boy uphill toward a ridge where she knew the trees opened to a rocky overlook. From there she might catch sight of the village rooftops, or at least confirm which way they needed to go. But when they reached the top, her hope sank. Mist still clung to the land below, veiling the distance in shifting white. No rooftops, no steeple, no signs of home only. Forest stretching far in every direction. The boy pressed against her side, and she could feel his small body trembling. She placed a hand on the rough stone beside her and steadied her breath. "We'll find the way," she murmured, more to herself than to him. Yet even as she said it, movement below caught her eye. Through the mist, a figure slipped silently between the trees, then another, then a third. They were too far to make out clearly, but their presence was undeniable. The boy stiffened at the sight, his hand clutching tightly at her sleeve. He didn't need to speak. His silence said everything. The girl's thoughts raced. She could not lead him back the way they came. It would take them straight into the path of those following. The stream was no longer safe either. That left only deeper ground, the parts of the forest even she had avoided. But choice was no longer hers to hesitate over. She took his hand firmly, pulling him toward the thicker woods at the far edge of the ridge. They descended quickly, branches clawing at their arms, roots threatening to trip them at every step. The boy stumbled once, nearly falling, but she caught him, her own breath ragged. The shadows beneath the pines grew thicker, swallowing the sunlight. The air felt colder here, heavy with the smell of moss and damp stone. She slowed, listening. Behind them, faintly, there were footsteps. Not close, but not far enough either. Whoever followed was patient, unhurried, confident. The boy whispered something in his own tongue. Words she did not understand, but the fear in his voice was clear. She wished she could answer him, reassure him, but all she could offer was her hand, firm and steady. They pressed on until the trees gave way to a hollow where the ground dipped low. A circle of stone and earth that felt older than memory. Strange? Carvings marked the rocks here too, sharper than the ones she had seen before. The boy froze, eyes wide, and shook his head violently. He tugged at her arm, trying to pull her back, but before they could retreat, a branch cracked loudly above them. Both looked up. The forest was silent again, but the air felt alive with tension. The girl's heart pounded, her mind racing. She tightened her grip on the boy's hand, pulling him close. The morning sun had climbed high now, but its light seemed powerless in this place. The forest seemed to close in tighter, watching, waiting. And as the sound of another footstep echoed faintly from the ridge above, the girl knew that their journey was only pulling them deeper into the unknown. The hollow was darker than the girl expected, even though the morning sun had climbed higher in the sky. The stones seemed to drink the light, their surfaces damp with moss, their carvings etched so deeply that they looked like wounds in the earth itself. The boy tugged at her sleeve, shaking his head again, his face pale with fear. She didn't know his words, but she understood enough. They had stumbled into a place meant for silence, not footsteps. The forest held its breath. For a moment, she thought the sound of pursuit had faded, that whoever followed them had turned away. But then came the faint crack of another branch, deliberate this time, as though the unseen figure wanted them to know they were not alone. The boy clung to her hand, his grip strong despite his trembling. She could feel the heat of his fear pressing into her own skin, and it only sharpened her sense of urgency. She pulled him gently toward the far side of the hollow, but every step seemed to echo, magnified in the stillness. The stone stood like Watchmen, their markings twisting in the corners of her eyes, and she found herself glancing back at them again and again. She had grown up among whispers of spirits, warnings about straying too deep, but standing here with the boy's hand in hers, those whispers felt less like stories and more like truths. As they slipped into the thicker trees beyond the hollow, the girl felt the boy's pace falter. He was exhausted, his legs unsteady. She crouched beside him, brushing damp hair from his forehead. His eyes darted nervously, but he leaned into her touch as though he had been waiting for someone to see him, to steady him. She wished she could ask his name, but words were clumsy things between them. So instead she gave him a small nod and whispered, "We'll keep going. Just a little more." He nodded faintly, though she knew he barely understood. Still, the reassurance seemed to give him enough strength to move again. They pressed forward until the trees thinned, opening into a narrow glade where sunlight poured down in streaks. It should have been comforting, but the girl stopped suddenly when she noticed the ground. The grass was pressed flat, not by animals, but by human feet, many of them. The boy froze too. His eyes widened as he stared at the prints, and his lips parted in a soundless whisper. She could tell he recognized them. Whoever had been here was not far ahead, and from the depth of the tracks, they had moved as a group. She glanced back the way they came, torn between the threat behind and the danger ahead. Her stomach twisted. It was clear now that this was no accident. The boy had not simply wandered into the forest. He had been taken or hunted, and she had led them both deeper into the heart of it. They moved along the edge of the glade, keeping low, careful not to step into the trampled grass. The girl's mind raced, replaying the boy's whispered words. They followed. She wondered if he had seen their faces, if he knew who they were, but fear kept his voice locked tight. The forest began to shift again, the ground rising into a series of ridges. From the top of one, the girl caught sight of smoke curling faintly through the trees. Not the heavy smoke of fire, but thin trails, deliberate and steady. A camp. She crouched low, pulling the boy down with her, her pulse thundering in her ears. Where they hid, she could just make out the shapes of figures moving around the smoke. They were too far to see clearly, but their movements were organized, their presence purposeful. The boy pressed against her side, his breath quick, and she realized with certainty that whoever these people were, they were the reason he was in the forest. She could have turned back then, could have led the boy in another direction, but a strange pull held her. Something about this place, about the way the tribe's child had been taken, gnawed at her. This was no simple disappearance. It was tied to something larger, something that stretched between the village, the tribe, and the land they all feared, yet relied upon. The boy tugged at her hand again, urging her away, and reluctantly she retreated with him, slipping back into the cover of the trees. But the image of that smoke lingered in her mind, as did the knowledge that they were caught in a snare far bigger than either of them could escape easily. They walked until the forest grew thick again, the ground soft with pine needles. The boy finally stumbled, collapsing to his knees. She knelt beside him, her heart heavy with worry. He was too young, too tired to keep fleeing. They needed a place to hide, even just for a short while. She led him to the roots of a fallen oak, its trunk hollowed by age. It offered shelter from watchful eyes, and though it was damp, it was safer than the open ground. The boy curled up against the roots, his small body trembling with both fear and exhaustion. She sat beside him, keeping her eyes fixed on the trees. Her thoughts turned to the village again. Would they even notice she was gone? She doubted it. Few had ever looked for her when she slipped into the forest before. Perhaps some would whisper about her foolishness, shake their heads and mutter about the orphan girl who thought herself braver than she was. None of them would imagine she was sitting here with the tribe's missing child pressed against her, caught between forces neither could fully name, Hours passed slowly. The forest shifted with the day, birds quieting, insects humming. The boy slept fitfully, his small hand still clutching her sleeve even in dreams. She remained awake, alert, her knife in hand, though she knew it was little against whoever shadowed them. As the sun dipped lower, painting the woods in amber light, the sound of voices drifted faintly through the trees. Not close, but near enough to stir her blood cold. They were not speaking the tribe's tongue, nor the settlers. The words were strange, clipped, unfamiliar. She strained to listen, but the sounds faded as quickly as they came, leaving only silence again. The boy stirred, his eyes snapping. "Open," he had heard them too. His face paled, and he whispered something she could not understand, but the tone was clear fear, deep and raw. She placed a finger to her lips, urging him to stay quiet, and together they listened to the silence. Stretched long and heavy. Night began to creep into the forest, shadows lengthening, the air cooling. She knew they could not stay by the fallen oak forever, but moving in the dark was dangerous. Still, the voices had unsettled her enough that remaining here felt just as perilous. She roused the boy gently, and together they slipped once more into the gathering dark. The forest had changed now. It felt less like a place of life and more like a maze of unseen threats. Every owl's call, every rustle of leaves set her nerves alight. The boy clung close, his small steps careful, his breaths shallow. They climbed another ridge, and from the top she paused, looking down. Through the trees below, she could see firelight flickering, not the small glow of a campfire, but several, burning steady and bright. The boy's grip tightened painfully on her arm. His eyes shone with recognition and terror, and in that moment, she understood. Whoever these people were, they were not strangers to him. He knew them, and he feared them. The girl's heart pounded as she crouched low, pulling him with her. They could not go forward, not into the firelight. Yet behind them, she sensed the shadows still moving, still watching. The forest had become a trap, closing tighter with every step. She swallowed hard, her eyes fixed on the distant flames. The boy trembled beside her, his breath quick against the night air. She felt the weight of their situation pressing down like stone. Whatever lay ahead was not just danger, it was the heart of the mystery. The reason the child had vanished, the reason the forest felt alive with unseen eyes. And now, standing between the firelight and the shadows, she knew there was no turning back. The only path was forward, deeper into the darkness, toward answers that might cost them both more than they could imagine. The firelight below flickered like a warning, throwing tall shadows across the trunks of the trees. The girl crouched low, her breath shallow, her arm wrapped protectively around the boy's shoulders. His small body trembled against her side, and she could feel the uneven rhythm of his heartbeat. The forest seemed to grow sharper with the night, every branch and stone alive with menace, every sound carrying farther than it should. Somewhere in the distance an owl cried, and then all was still again, as though the woods themselves were holding their breath. She studied the camp through the gaps in the leaves. At least 4 fires burned steady, casting circles of light where dark figures moved in silence. They did not behave like hunters returning from a long day's work, nor villagers resting at day's end. Their movements were careful, deliberate, watchful. She could not make out their faces, but their presence was enough to send a chill deeper into her bones. The boy's grip on her arm tightened painfully, his wide eyes fixed on the camp. She turned to him, whispering low, "You know them." He did not answer in words, but the way he pressed closer, the way his face twisted with dread, told her more than any speech could. Whoever those people were, they had taken him or worse, her. Mind raced. She had led him this far, but now she was faced with the choice of whether to retreat or press forward. Behind them lurked the steady rhythm of pursuit, the unseen figures who had tracked them from the hollow. Ahead burned the fires of those the boy feared. Either way, danger hemmed them in. She pulled him back into the shadow of the ridge, her hand brushing the rough bark of a pine. "We wait," she whispered. The boy buried his face against her sleeve, and together they listened to the night stretch long. The fire crackled faintly below, and in the quiet she thought she heard voices, low and rhythmic. Not the laughter of villagers, not the chants of the tribe, but something colder. A cadence that rose and fell like a pattern meant to unsettle. Her skin prickled as the sound reached her ears, though the words meant nothing. The boy shuddered, whispering something she could not understand. And for the first time she saw tears glimmer in his eyes. The girl had never been one to cry. Tears had left her long ago, taken with the parents she barely remembered. But something about the boy's quiet sobs cut deeper than any fear. She pulled him into her arms, shielding him from the night as best she could, even though her own heart pounded with dread. "I won't leave you," she whispered, though the forest mocked her with its silence. Time passed in heavy drops, each moment dragging slower than the last. The fires below burned steady, the figures moving like shadows against the glow. At one point, she thought she saw one of them glance up the ridge, and her body froze, pressing the boy tightly against her. The figure paused, then moved again, vanishing into the circle of light. When at last she dared to move, the moon had risen high, silvering the leaves. She nudged the boy awake, his eyes fluttering open with fear still heavy in them. "We can't stay here," she whispered. He nodded faintly, though she knew he had no strength left to argue. They slid down the ridge slowly, careful not to break branches or send stones tumbling. Each step felt louder than thunder in her ears, though the camp remained distant. She aimed not for the fires, but for the edge of the woods that curved behind them. If she could circle wide, perhaps she might catch a clearer view, perhaps even learn what bound this boy to these people. The air grew colder as they crept, and the night pressed heavier. The closer they moved, the clearer the voices became. Now she could hear the rise and fall of their strange cadence, the crackle of fire feeding their rhythm. It was not joy, not mourning, but something in between, something she did not want to understand. The boy gripped her hand tightly, his small body trembling with each step. His eyes darted to the shadows, to the glow of the flames, as though each flicker pulled a memory he wished to bury. She wanted to ask him more, wanted to know why he had been taken, but the moment was not safe for questions. All that mattered was moving, watching, surviving. At last they reached a cluster of rocks, where the girl crouched low and pulled the boy beside her. From here, she could see more clearly. Figures gathered around the fire, their shapes sharp against the flames. They wore no colors of the tribe, no coats of the village, but a mixture of both patchwork garments, rough and strange. Some carried weapons carved from bone and wood, others tools she could not name. Their faces flickered in and out of the firelight, but each one bore the same hollow focus, eyes fixed on the fire as though bound to it. The girl's breath caught. She did not recognize them, but she understood enough. These were not villagers, nor tribe, but something that had lived in the spaces between, hidden, unspoken. The boy pressed his face against her arm, whispering low. She strained to catch the words, and though the tongue was foreign, she thought she caught one meaning. Repeated again and again, "Not safe." Her chest tightened. She had thought herself brave in leaving the village, in following his trail into the forest. But now, crouched in the shadows, watching strangers dance between firelight and darkness, she felt the edge of fear cut sharper than it ever had before. Sudden crack broke the rhythm. One of the figures turned sharply, raising a hand. The voices stilled. The girl froze, her hand pressed over the boy's mouth to quiet him. For a heartbeat, silence rang louder than any sound. Then, slowly, the figures turned their heads, not toward the fire, not toward one another, but toward the ridge. Toward them. Her heart slammed against her ribs. She ducked low, pulling the boy flat against the rocks. The forest held its breath again, and she dared not move. A figure stepped from the firelight, moving closer to the edge of the camp, scanning the trees with sharp, patient eyes. The girl's thoughts raced. If they were seen, there would be no running fast enough. She pressed the boy tighter against the cold stone, whispering prayers she hadn't spoken since she was younger. Words her memory barely recalled. The figure stood for what felt like an eternity, scanning the shadows, listening to the silence. Then, at last, it turned back, slipping once more into the firelight. The voices rose again, softer now, but no less chilling. The girl exhaled slowly, her hands trembling. The boy clung to her, his small body stiff with terror. They could not linger here. She knew now that whatever bound these people to the fire was the same force that had drawn the boy into the forest. And she knew too that if they stayed, the forest itself might swallow them whole. She pulled the boy gently to his feet, leading him back into the dark. Their steps were silent, careful, but the memory of those hollow faces followed close behind. The forest no longer felt like trees and soil, but like a living net, every shadow a snare waiting to tighten. As they climbed another ridge, the girl glanced back, her eyes catching one last glimpse of the fire. The figures still moved, still whispered their strange rhythm, but for a moment she thought she saw one lift its head, eyes gleaming in the dark, fixed directly on her. Her breath caught, and she pulled the boy faster into the thickets, into the cold silence of the woods. The night was no longer just dangerous, it was alive, pulsing with unseen forces that pressed closer with every step. And though the village lay somewhere beyond the trees, though the dawn would come again, she knew the path ahead was no longer a simple journey home. The fire had shown her the edge of something vast, something that reached beyond the boy, beyond the tribe, beyond the village. Now, with the boy's hand in hers and the forest pressing tighter around them, she felt the story rushing toward its breaking point. The night itself seemed to lean closer, holding its breath, waiting for the moment when everything would shatter. The forest pressed in tighter as the girl pulled the boy through the dark, her heart pounding like a drum in her chest. Behind them, the firelight flickered faintly through the trees, a reminder of what they had seen and what still followed them. Every shadow seemed alive, every sound too sharp, but she did not slow. The boy clung to her hand, his steps stumbling, yet determined, as if some thread of hope still tied him to her strength. The hours of the night stretched long, but at last the forest began to thin. The girl noticed how the air felt lighter, fresher, and soon the pale light of dawn began to creep between the branches. The boy lifted his head, his eyes catching the first glow of morning. He whispered something in his own tongue, the word trembling but filled with relief. She did not know its meaning, but she understood enough. They were closer to safety. They pressed forward until the trees opened into a wide clearing. Here the grass bent beneath the wind, and beyond the far edge stood figures waiting. The girl stopped, her grip tightening on the boy's hand. For an instant her stomach clenched, fearing they had stumbled into another trap. But then she saw the faces, stern but familiar, painted with earth and shadow. The tribe had come. The boy let out a cry, breaking from her grasp to run forward. His small feet carried him across the clearing, and when he reached the waiting arms of his people, he was gathered up with shouts of relief. The girl stood frozen, her chest rising and falling with sharp breaths. She had carried him through the forest, kept him safe through the night, but now he was no longer hers to guard. He belonged here, among those who had feared for him. Of the elders stepped forward, his face lined with both years and wisdom. His dark eyes rested on her, steady and unblinking. He spoke words she could not understand, but the tone was not harsh. It was measured, filled with weight. Another figure came beside him, translating into the broken language the settlers and tribes shared. "You brought him back," the translator said. "You crossed where others would not. You walked the forest when even we feared to." The girl lowered her eyes, unsure what to say. She had not acted for glory or for thanks. She had only followed her heart, unwilling to leave the boy to his fate. "He was alone," she murmured. "I could not let him be alone." The elder listened, then nodded slowly. He lifted his hand toward her, a gesture that seemed to bridge more than words. The tribe gathered close, their voices rising in low tones, carrying into the morning air. The boy clung to his people, yet he looked back at her once, his eyes filled with something she would never forget. It was not just gratitude, but trust, the kind that could not be broken by fear or silence. The dawn deepened, spilling golden light across the clearing. The girl felt the weight of exhaustion settle into her bones, but with it came a strange calm. The forest behind them still stirred with mysteries, still carried the thread of those who gathered in secret by the fires. Yet for now the boy was safe, and she had proven herself in ways she had never imagined. The elder spoke again, his voice rising with strength, and the translator's words carried across the clearing. "At dawn, you are no longer the orphan who walks alone. You are a protector. You are crowned with honor, for you carried a child through the forest when danger hunted you both." The tribe's voices joined together, rising in chorus. The girl stood still, overwhelmed, her hands trembling at her sides. She had lived her life in the shadows of the village, unseen, unwanted. Now the morning light crowned her with a recognition she had never dreamed possible. She was no longer just the orphan girl. She was something more. The boy broke free from the arms that held him and ran back to her side. He pressed his small hand into hers once more, looking up with a smile that seemed to chase away the last traces of night. His eyes spoke what words could not, that he would never forget, that her courage had written itself into his heart. As the sun lifted higher, the girl felt the warmth spread across her face. The tribe gathered around them, their voices still strong, their presence a shield against the shadows of the forest. She glanced back once more at the trees, knowing the dangers were not gone, that the figures by the fire might rise again. But she also knew that she was no longer alone. She had crossed from the silence of the village into the strength of a people, who now saw her as one of their own. The clearing filled with light, and in that moment, everything seemed to pause. The girl breathed deeply, letting the air fill her lungs, letting the weight of the night fall away. She thought of the village, of the whispers that had followed her all her life, and she realized they no longer held power. The forest had tested her, the shadows had chased her, and yet she stood here, alive, carrying both herself and the boy into dawn. The tribe crowned her not with gold or jewels, but with something far greater, the honor of being remembered, the place of belonging she had longed for. The boy stood at her side, his hand still in hers, and together they faced the rising sun. In the days to come, the story of that night would be told and retold. The orphan girl who tracked a lost native child through the forest, who braved dangers no one else dared, would no longer walk in silence. She had become a part of something larger than herself, a thread woven into the history of the people she had saved. And though the forest still whispered with secrets, though its shadows still hid mysteries that would one day rise again, the girl carried within her the courage of that night. She had looked into the heart of fear and walked forward anyway. As the tribe lifted their voices higher, as dawn crowned the clearing with light, she closed her eyes for a moment and let herself feel it, the belonging she had sought all her life, the peace of knowing she had given everything and gained more than she could ever have imagined. The boy's hand squeezed hers one last time before he turned back to his people, running into their arms with laughter now replacing fear. The girl watched him go, her heart full, and for the first time she did not feel the sting of being left behind. She had found her place, not through birth or blood, but through choice, through courage, through the unshakable will to stand when no one else would. The forest was behind her, the dawn before her, and the story complete. The orphan girl was no longer unseen. She had become a hero,